So previously we talked about the difference in plants that are taken care of by people, the cultivated plants, the domesticated plants that have been changed by people. And the topic of domesticated plants has a long human history. We look at thousands of years over time as these plants have changed along with the people who have made the changes. And this topic today is more of a look to the future and modern versions of basically modifying plants using the tools that are available to us now. So the topic here talked about engineering. You talked about genetically modified organisms. That's kind of the topic we're going to cover here. So let's get into it. This is becoming a bigger concern as the global human population is continuing to increase, and the places on Earth where you can grow crops, they kind of stay the same. So there's a limit to the ability to grow plants to feed the people of the world. And there's a lot of research kind of going after trying to find out how to do this more efficiently, possibly even in places where crops haven't been able to be grown earlier, and now we can maybe put them into places using these breeding kind of new generation tools to get genetics into the plants that help to advantage them there. So conventionally, just a little bit of a contrast here, conventionally, we talked about this to get a plant that you're able to modify into a food plant. Say you want to make a potato out of it. You need a starting plant that's got something that can be modified into a potato. So you probably have an ancestral plant that makes some tubers underground. And through selection, through continuing to propagate the ones that are making big and nutritious and not toxic tubers, you end up with the ancestors of potatoes. And these days we have very large potatoes that are produced by these plants that benefit people. But the starting point is a plant that's making a structure that can be modified. And we also talked about the need to start with variation. So this is taking advantage of natural variation, maybe augmented a little bit with some lucky mutations along the way. But it's kind of a slow process depending on natural change to the genetics and the DNA of an organism. And the limitations then are certainly this wouldn't happen very quickly. You've got to wait for the right kind of mutations to come around. And then also you're limited by the species you're working in. So you may want whatever you can put into a potato, but at the end of the day, it's still a potato through conventional breeding. And so it's not going to have some of the, say, vitamins you get from a carrot because it's just a potato. But what if we could maybe mix those two together? That's where the realm of genetic modification comes in. So speaking of breeding, you can successfully breed plants that are related to each other. And usually that means within a species. One of the ways to define what a species is means that it's a group of plants or other organisms that can successfully reproduce offspring together. And so when we look at one of these with a scientific name, Solanum lycopersicum, the tomato, Solanum melongena, the eggplant, these are species that on their own, they have an ancestry, a natural ancestry, where they were breeding with each other. And another part of the species definition is that they're not too successful at breeding with any other species. So sometimes you're able to produce a hybrid between two existing species. But in a lot of cases, you just can't breed plants that are too distantly related. Certainly you can't breed outside of, say, the same plant family or usually the same plant genus. So these are a variety of plants in the genus called Solanum. It's a big and diverse genus, and it happens to have some food products. The tomatoes, potatoes, and eggplants are all in this group. So potentially in this one group of plants, you could do some natural crosses if you were able to get successful offspring out of one of these crosses. But otherwise, if you want to combine something, the genetics of a potato with the other benefits of a raspberry or something, you wouldn't be able to mix those two together because they're very distant organisms that wouldn't be able to mate together. So we get over to genetic engineering or genetic modification. And this has probably a few definitions in people's minds. I think probably the fairest and the most scientific way to define this is that we talk about genetic engineering in making a laboratory change to the DNA of an organism And a lot of times this involves taking DNA from one organism and putting it into another organism. So we'll see some cases of that. But this is a big focus on starting with the DNA. This would be in laboratories where you can manipulate the DNA molecule and then put it back into a living organism that be able to do the outcome that you're interested in. So I kind of enjoy this. It's a stock photo. You can sometimes see interesting stock photos like this. It's kind of fanciful though. So people make fun of these images because it's got a person basically wearing the personal protective equipment that they would have in a laboratory where they're careful not to contaminate anything. And then they're standing out in a field where there's just natural contamination with all the organisms that are out there. So mold spores and pollen grains and all these things are out in the world. So this isn't a real depiction of genetic engineering, but it's a fun little image to work with at this point. So before we get into some examples, maybe take some time to think about, well, if you could breed a trait into a plant, and let's say the sky's the limit, you have no limitations on what you can put into an organism, what would you put into the plants we currently have in the world, maybe the economically important plants of the world? What would you do to modify them to turn to your benefit? So I have a silly image here again. This is the plants versus zombies. And the plants have a variety of modifications to defend against zombie attacks. So maybe that's what you want to plan for.